In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. We are talking about ethics and the Supreme Court, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
All right, good, 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 good. So when I suggested this topic, you said that you were going to be doing a bit of research. Does that mean it wasn't up on your radar before I mentioned it?
Well, I had heard about it, but typically when stories like this come out, it seems like at first you hear all these kind of breathless news reports about everything that's gone wrong, and you just kind of have to wait for the dust to settle a little bit and then see, okay, well, was something really done that was terrible, or are people kind of overreacting? So it was a little bit of that and a little bit of I heard about it, and I don't know, I haven't researched Clarence Thomas too much, but he seems like he could be a hero of mine. He seems
Oh,
like
really?
oh
Okay.
yeah, he seems like an awesome person. He seems really cool. And so I when I heard it, I was like, oh, probably nothing there, but we'll look into it and just see, and I didn't want to be too, but I mean, if all that stuff is there, I'm happy to look into it and be proven wrong. First of all, because I haven't really studied them too much. Second of all, because you never know. Sometimes you could learn something and somebody gets convicted of something and then you find out that they're different than you thought. So I was happy to look into it. But he seems like a really cool person. And so I heard it coming out and I'm like, oh, I'm guessing I'm gonna look into this and there won't be as much to it as they're saying.
Okay. Well, before we get into the details of that, I am just sort of curious if you could give me like the 30-second summary of why you consider him to be something of a heroic figure for you.
Well, because he came from I can see that you feel the opposite.
I don't know a whole lot about him. I didn't really consider him to be one that, of all the Supreme Court justices that really gets a lot of attention. I'm just curious. Go ahead.
You don't think he gets a lot of attention? Is that what you said?
I think that there's other justices that get a lot more attention than he does. He started to show up recently. I want to say in the last couple of years as someone who was seen as writing a lot of opinions. But before that, he was sort of a silent figure on the Supreme Court, at least in my
Yeah,
reading of it.
I agree, and I think that's really sad because he's accomplished so much. He came from the Jim Crow South. He came from poverty, worked his way up, and he's been on the Supreme Court for a long time. But it seems as if a lot of people kind of ignore him because because he's conservative. I mean, I guess not that conservatives are ignoring him because of that, but it seems like he is looked down upon, even though he's this person that it seems like the left would hold up as like, wow, this person, overcame so much in spite of racism and adversity and poverty and everything else. He's done so well, but they don't seem to do that. I was trying to. There was a. Um, Let me just see if I could find because um, this lady was talking about. Found an article where this lady was talking about Clarence Thomas and talking about how it's interesting that there just isn't a lot said about him because he really should be held up as kind of a person who's really overcome a lot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, and I really can't speak for other people, but it's possible that maybe part of the reason he doesn't get as much uh, uh, much screen time as far as his backstory, maybe because of the tarnish of his confirmation hearings, possibly.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that was sad too. And this lady, um, Yale Law School seems to have misplaced its portrait of Justice Thomas, and I think he graduated from there. The
Hmm.
Smithsonian African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. opened with no mention of Justice Thomas except as the object of Anita Hill's accusations. And it's interesting to me that because he has written from what little I've read, it seems like he's written not a lot of the majority, but a lot of majority opinions, more than many other people on the Supreme Court over the years. But he's kind of overlooked. And to me, he's always seemed like a really interesting person. There was a documentary talking about, and it's funny that this stuff has come out about Harlan Crow and how that Harlan Crow is the billionaire that they're saying has given him these lavish gifts and everything, and has shown that he, can be bought off. And this documentary was talking about how he doesn't really like those big, lavish vacations. In fact, most of the time over the past 20 or 40 years, when he goes on vacation, he like hops in his RV and just cruises around the country in his RV with his wife. And he's like, I don't really like to travel to Europe. Like, it's cool and everything, but there's so much to see here. He just likes to go to small towns and, stop at Walmart. He's kind of a humble guy. Um, and so that was another reason that I liked him. But then this stuff came out about Harlan Crow, and I'm like, oh, maybe I was mistaken. But after looking into it, I still feel pretty strongly that he's a great person.
Well, let's get into it. So all this came about because there was a report in the ProPublica that that Clarence Thomas and his wife Ginny Thomas was receiving large, I could say, frequent gifts that would have a very large value if someone were to value them out. And so then the question comes, I guess, a couple things. One, would it influence was there any evidence that these gifts had influenced some of his decisions? Did Clarence Thomas follow all of the ethical rules that he was supposed to follow with respect to these gifts? And I also would like to look at some of the reporting by the media about those gifts, because I find also that to be a little bit interesting. So the gifts primarily consisted of travel, vacations, travel in a private jet, in a yacht, some destinations that Harlan Crow had paid for. Harlan Crow also paid the tuition for his sort of adopted son. I think it was like a great grandnephew was the child that received some pretty pricey tuition gifts from Harlan Crow. So if we want to start there and look at those, is there any direction you want to take some of that?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to get a clear picture of it. This one article I was reading about said they were describing that the act that Harlan Crow and Clarence Thomas, she described it as two friends engaged in private acts of charity and love to care for and educate a child. Um, I mean, I don't know. They paid for his education. It wasn't his son. Maybe it was like, hey, and the other thing that, in all of this stuff, so there's that, which, I'm going to have to see a lot more evidence that that was something nefarious. And then there was, he bought some real estate from Clarence Thomas,
That's right.
and
Yes.
she described it this way: Crow bought the white cinder block house that with two vacant lots for $133,000 to preserve them for history. He probably concluded that no one else was going to do so, and with good reason. Now, this is the place um, uh, where he had Thomas and his brother were raised by their grandfather with hard work, discipline, and tough love. And so his mom or his grandma still lives there, and he's buying it for history because he's a pretty famous national figure. I mean, is he the first or he's the second Black Supreme Court justice? Is that right?
I think it's the second. Thurgood Marshall was the first. I don't think there was any before or between the two of them.
I think you're right. And even that, Brian, like you say, well, I don't know. I've never heard very much about him. Like he's written a ton of majority opinions. He's the second Black Supreme Court justice ever, and he's kind of ignored, which is
Yeah.
really interesting to me. And but then he bought those probably to preserve them for history. It wasn't a lot of money. Like it just seems like there's not a lot there. I don't know a ton about the lavish travel gifts or something like that. Like, but I could see you going with some friends and you go on a vacation. Like I think Kelly's paid for stuff for me. And what's never been shown is that there's actually a quid pro quo where Harlan Crow got something because of what was given to Clarence Thomas.
And that's a really good point, and we're definitely gonna get into that one because you are correct. There. Well, I don't want to go into it now. So if we first of all talk about the tuition, and this is based on You and I, Colin, we this is something we do in the evenings when we got a little bit of spare time. So we're doing a bit of research, but we're not doing the extensive and exhaustive research that a journalist or a lawyer might be doing. So, given what I
A
found,
journalist, the journalists just repeat whatever came out on the news, on the AP, or that they read in the New York Times.
you're
Come
sounding
on.
very cynical right there.
Well, you read some of those news stories. They're like they're almost the same thing. You read some of
Yeah,
these news stories, and it's like, oh, the MS, they're the same. They're the same story. They
yeah,
don't
and
even change a lot of the descriptors. Like it's the same exact story.
I definitely want to spend some time on the coverage of this because it was once I started doing my own research, I was a little disappointed in the coverage too. So the tuition first, from first of all, from a tax perspective, what I found was that uh, uh, donations that are not gifts, one of those categories being a direct payment to qualifying educational institutions of tuition. And what that means is that this would not qualify. It does not need to be reported within the category of gifts. It wouldn't eventually, if the numbers get high enough, trigger the gift tax. So one of the things that does come up is in the did Clarence Thomas break any rules or laws? And in that situation, he did not. It likes to get reported frequently, and I suppose it's worth reporting, but it also needs to be clarified that he did not break any tax laws when he didn't report it. Now, he should have, from my reading of it, listed it as a gift within the financial disclosure documents that the Supreme Court judges are supposed to be filling out annually. So that although it wasn't a taxable event, it was still a financial gift that he and his family benefited by. And so there could have been an ethical lapse in not reporting that tuition.
Yeah, I disagree. Why do you say that?
Well, because it was a very large amount of monnie, and
Not to
someone else
him.
paid it. What?
Not to him.
Well, to his dependent.
Oh, I don't know if he was. What do you? Are you certain he was dependent at the time?
He claimed it. He claimed that the child had been living with him for years, and that the child was living him before he went off to the schools.
Well, he was living with him, but I don't know that he was necessarily dependent, or if he gave it to his son, like what he had. Like, is that what the financial disclosure rules say? And where do these financial disclosure rules come from? And because are these disclosure rules that just the Supreme Court is deciding, hey, well, I guess we'll kind of live by these or something? Because I don't, from what I've read, the Congress doesn't have the right legally to enforce anything. So are these disclosure rules that you're talking about? Are they just that some Supreme Court justices have said, well, we'll abide by this?
No, this is what
And what
all
exactly
this.
do they say? Like, I think that people are jumping to conclusions like, yeah, he had to report this. He didn't think he did. And he's a pretty smart legal scholar.
Well, yeah, he's a legal scholar, but not a financial whiz because he got this one wrong. Under the
It's not
ethics,
nothing to do with financial whiz, Brian. This is legal. This is,
well,
or it's not even legal. It's ethical. It's not financial whiz. It's whether or not he had to report it. And this is exactly what he would know.
no, because okay, under the Ethics in Governments Act of 1978, all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, are required to file annual financial disclosures that include reporting on gifts received, but they are exempt from disclosing personal hospitality they receive, which covers food, lodging, and entertainment.
Yeah, he did. I mean, if it's for his, and what even further, like first you said that he receives, he didn't receive it. It's his great grandnephew or something like that. And so I'm not 100% sure that is even a requirement for him to report. But let's say that you'd think it was or something. I don't know. That Financial Disclosure Act, the Congress does not have the right to enforce that on the Supreme Court.
Well, actually, and whether it's voluntary or not, this is something that all the Supreme Court justices are filling out because this was an issue before. In 2011, he got in trouble for not filling out his documents correctly. This is something that all the Supreme Court justices are filling out. I found a listing from 2018 where they had actually posted what each of the Supreme Court justices had reported in this document. So he may have gotten it wrong what he was supposed to report, but he absolutely was supposed to fill out this document and report it. Now, there's no consequences for filling it out incorrectly. This is just an ethical form. This is not a law, and there's no fines, there's no crimes, there's no.
Because they have no jurisdiction, as I said before. And I don't know, I like you're just read somewhere that somebody said, oh, he should have done it in this case. Well, if he has a different opinion, or the people that are advising him on this have a different opinion, there's different opinions out there. I don't
Well,
know.
no. Okay, there was he is overseen by the where is it, the judicial governance, I think it's called. I got to go and find it, but he there was an investigation to some of his reportings before, where he did not report what he needed to do, or did what he didn't report it accurately. Uh, this came about in 2011 or 2012. And he got it wrong then. Where is it? Here it is. Give me just a moment.
Yeah, that's fine.
This is one of the articles that I linked to. It's above the law, judiciary Thomas's ethical lapses in 2012. In 2011, Thomas came under scrutiny for failing to report years of income earned by his wife, Jenny Thomas. The expressed concern that the Judicial Conference of the United States, the judiciary's policy-making body, was being kept in the dark and shut out from potentially doing its own review of the complaints, according to letters that were looked at by Bloomberg. So this, what is the name? The Judicial Conference of the United States is the organization that is overseeing.
They're in charge of the Supreme Court, is what you're saying?
No, they're not. They're not in charge of the Supreme Court. They're the ones that check on the ethics.
So some letter, but I mean that was worded very carefully. What you just read, like, hey, these guys, there was some concern about what he did. Like,
Right.
well, okay, well, somebody was concerned about it. I'm sure other people were like, no, that's fine. You don't have to report it. Like,
Okay.
it's similar to the article you sent me. Like, was there incriminating evidence? Was there incriminating evidence? Did he do something wrong? And you just said like he hasn't broken any laws, but ethically, well, I mean, ethics are.
What are you speaking about right now?
Well, you sent me an article, and I don't want to get off topic on this, but you sent me an article about the Republican committee that was looking into President Biden, and the reporting on it was worded very interestingly, where it said they don't have any, they had to admit that they didn't have any incriminating evidence or something like that. They said,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, they're just starting, and not having incriminating evidence is different than not having evidence. They can't indict him. No, so I want to know with Clarence Thomas, like, I mean, what we're both saying here is there's no incriminating evidence, but you read somebody said, well, I saw that there was some concerning stuff, and that's why I wrote some letters, about
Well,
Clarence Thomas. Like, that doesn't prove that he did something wrong or that there was ethical problems with the things that he did.
no, I was only referencing an article because you were talking about the judicial conference, which has oversight over the judges, including the Supreme Court. Now, it's not to say that they can, that they have control over the Supreme Court, because we know that the Supreme Court is, the final arbiter in all things legal. But there are bodies that look at things like the ethics and look at these other documents that the Supreme Court has to fill out. That was my point about that particular issue. They are supposed to, according to that 1978 law, be filling out all these documents, and every single Supreme Court judge does. And there was some questions in this particular issue in 2011, why Clarence Thomas was not reporting the income that his wife was earning. In fact, I'll read to you what it said. It said, the claim that Thomas could have made the error of not reporting his wife's income when he had to check a box claiming that his wife made no income over $1,000. And he checked that box for every year that he was in the Supreme Court, when in fact his wife was working quite a bit. And so this was the lapse, the ethical lapse that they were referring to back in 2011, 2012. Now that is kind of secondary. The reason why it's coming up now as being maybe relevant is because people are saying he's claiming he didn't know, when he had this other ethical lapse about 12 years ago, where someone had pointed out that he'd made a mistake, not the same mistake, a similar mistake about reporting income reporting gifts that people are giving to him.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look into what he says about it. I'm sure there's differing viewpoints on what he did back then. Maybe it was, something evil that he was just trying to hide his wife's income. You're saying this was the reporting that he did not for taxes, but just to report his income for his financial disclosures or something?
Not just the income, but also gifts that are given to him.
But
The
you're talking in 2012 about income. He was supposed to report his wife's income
Right,
on an ethical disclosure form.
right, yep.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look into it.
So the real estate one is one of particular interest because that one is, and I don't know if it's actually breaking the law, but that was one that was actually mentioned as there was I can't find the
You
citing
don't
of
know
it.
if it was breaking the law?
Well, there was a specific rule that was put in place, and I'd made a note of it, but I'm having trouble finding it within my notes, where all federal employees are supposed to report any real estate transaction of greater than $1,000. And so that $130,000 that property sold for, he never noted it in any of his documentation, and that was the issue, an issue
Wait, you
related to
said
it.
that any federal, can you repeat that? Any federal employee has to report real estate transactions of more than $1,000?
Yes. Yep.
To who?
Uh, all right. Now you're gonna make me. I wish I don't have it noted exactly. I'll find it though. Speak among
Yeah,
yourselves for a moment.
that seems like a crazy rule. I will tell you, I found the thing I was looking for before. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, like part of this, it does. I don't know. I'm just trying to make sense of it, because maybe he did all these terrible things, but sometimes a lot of it's blown out of proportion. There was a quote from Justice, and I know this doesn't exonerate him, but Sonia Sotomayor from the left-leaning side of the court. She said Justice Thomas is the one justice in the building that literally knows every employee's name, every one of them. And not only does he know their names, he remembers their families' names and histories. He's the first one who will go up to someone when you're walking with him and say, "Is your son okay? How's your daughter doing in college?" He's the first one that when my stepfather died, sent me flowers in Florida. He is a man who cares deeply about the court as an institution, about the people who work there, about people. So,
Mhm.
sometimes this gets blown out of proportion. Like, who those people who I think people outside, the pundits, the reporters, us, we sometimes think, well, these guys probably hate each other. They're fighting against each other, but I think they really respect each other. And they have different viewpoints and different ideas about the way ideologies. But even that's pretty high praise from Justice Sonia Sotomayor, not like one of the right leaning judges, but Sonia Sotomayor. It's pretty interesting. I wonder if a lot of this stuff, the more we delved into it, we would find that it isn't as bad as everybody's making it out to be. I
Okay,
know
so
that doesn't disprove everything that you're saying, but
right.
anyway.
No, no. I mean, it is worthwhile. I think he does sound like a very human individual, and sometimes some of these people can sound very aloof and separated. So there was a federal disclosure law passed after Watergate requiring justices and other officials to disclose the details of most real estate transactions over $1,000. Thomas never disclosed his sale of the Savannah properties. That appears to be in violation of the law, for ethics law experts told ProPublica.
Okay, maybe. I mean, it's $133,000. His mom or his grandma lives there. Like, I don't know. Maybe
Rent
it
free.
was a lot, huh?
Rent free.
Rent free, rent free. Okay, okay.
So
Yeah, I mean,
that increases that value of that property now. She's living there rent free. So, but I mean, you're right. It's only $130,000, but that is in direct violation of a federal law, and federal laws do apply to Supreme Court judges.
but you said a minute ago, like it's like they don't have the jurisdiction to pass laws. Like if he were really breaking a law in the way that you're phrasing it and the way that the way that you're saying it, we would put him in jail, I guess. So is it really breaking a law?
Well, it just became unearthed, so it's very possible that there could be a court case coming out of this. We don't know yet. This is still pending,
Well, I
possibly.
guess we'll see. I'm really
Yeah.
wondering if he's going to end up in jail, but I'm guessing he won't.
You're
I'm
probably
guessing.
right. You're probably right that he won't. That doesn't mean that he didn't break the law, though. I mean, this is people of power often do not get treated the same way that you and I do, and this is one of the things that we're really dealing with right now.
But I mean, I don't even think from the reading that I did, I don't believe that Congress has the authority to pass those sorts of laws to uh
Are you suggesting the Supreme Court doesn't have to follow the law, or the Supreme Court justices don't have to follow the same laws that you and I do?
I don't know that it's constitutional, is what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I've read that and they don't have from what I was reading, they don't have the right to implement rules to say you guys have to do these things because we said so. I don't think that they do, but I could be wrong.
No, I think you're right when they're talking about something specifically to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court must do this. If you work in the Supreme Court, this must be the rule you must follow. But the Supreme Court justices are not exempt from the law that everybody must follow. And if everyone is told that they must report real estate of greater than anything greater than $1,000, that will also apply to the Supreme Court justices.
You could be right, but when I read this article in Newsweek, it says Congress lacks constitutional power to compel Supreme Court justices to file such reports in the first place. The justices have gone along with it since 1978, presumably in the spirit of voluntary transparency. Congress has no power to impose such rules on the court or to enforce rules it makes for itself. See U.S. Constitution, Article 3. It's short enough for anyone to read. Once the Senate appoints a justice following the presidential nomination, its only constitutional power is to convict by trial if the House impeaches a justice for failure of good behavior.
Mm-hmm. You
So,
know
so
what would be
you
great?
when we
What would
phrase
be
it in this way, say like he's breaking the law, so we could put him in jail. Like I'm not sure that they can. I don't know that that was constitutional that they were putting those rules in place. Well, we made a law, so it's okay because it's a law, even though we shouldn't be governing the Supreme Court. Is we make laws, then we can govern the Supreme Court. Like I don't think you can do that.
Well, I mean, I get your point. I don't, can Congress create a law that would require the Supreme Court to follow any sort of guidelines? In this case, we're talking about ethical guidelines. I don't know. But I do think a great outcome of this particular situation would be to have this case actually go up there, because maybe all the way to the Supreme Court, because it would be amazing to see how they rule on whether or not the Supreme Court justices are required to follow laws. I think that's an interesting question to have answered by the Supreme Court.
But once again, you're phrasing it in a weird way, Brian. Does the Supreme Court do they have to follow laws? Of course, they have to follow laws. Like they can't speed, but they can't when you're talking about them in the activities of being a Supreme Court justice. No, I think they don't have the rules to say because you're a Supreme Court justice, you have to. We're going to look at your financial records. We're going to do no. You can't do that. You don't govern the Supreme Court. You can set rules for other parts of life, but not for the Supreme Court. You don't govern them.
Right. And
So,
so,
so you say you're phrasing in this weird way of like, do they have to actually follow laws? Yes, they
yeah,
have to follow laws,
okay.
but they can't. They are not going to be governed by Congress to do those types of things.
Okay. Well, I mean, we're getting to some hairs that are being split, and I think these are questions that do need to be answered, and I think that the whole question about the ethics is going to be the way in which this conversation continues, not just between you and I, but between other people as well. Because there was another situation with Neil Gorsuch, where he was a partial property owner of some property out in Colorado, I believe it was, and 8 days after he was confirmed as a Supreme Court judge, a buyer came along. That piece of property had been on the market for a while. A buyer came along and purchased the property 8 days after he became a Supreme Court judge. The buyer was the head of a law firm that frequently argues before the Supreme Court. And this was reported in Politico on April 25th, if you wanted to go and look at it to see the details of it. So yeah, there was, and so it wasn't just Clarence Thomas, but there's other people that this is starting to expand to include, and that one in particular is about real estate as well. And Neil Gorsuch, although he reported the sale of the property, he did not report who purchased the property, which would have been interesting or useful information. The I do want to talk for a second about the general ethics, because I think a lot of people are trying to argue whether the behavior was or did not adhere to the existing rules of ethics. And I think it's an important question to ask, but I think it's also important to looking forward. Should we have a code of ethics that the Supreme Court justices are required to follow? In other words, not looking about what was, but looking forward to what maybe could or should be.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts?
All this just seems so. It's almost like I feel like the problem is this. Whenever something goes wrong and government wants to step in to fix it, that's where you see government overreach. And I don't think very much has gone wrong here. It just doesn't seem that big of a deal. There's another person that there's retired Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who was nominated by Bill Clinton, and he came out and was saying on Thursday, Breyer described Thomas, who has recently been the center of a luxury gift scandal, as a man of integrity, saying he never saw his fellow judge act dishonestly for over 30 years shared on the Supreme Court. As far as I'm concerned, I sat next to him on the bench for 28 years. I like him. He's a friend of mine. I've never seen him do anything underhanded or say anything underhanded. My personal point of view is he's a man of integrity. So like we don't see anything going wrong, and then we're like, my gosh, we got to do something. Like I don't feel like the Supreme Court is the place where we should be looking. There's plenty to be done. And I see much worse, and I don't want to be just engaging in, you may come back and say, well, come on, that's just whataboutism, because what about all the, we both agree, as we've said in the past, that all these senators and congressmen are doing these inappropriate trades of stock and making millions of dollars when they
Yes,
have inside information. Like obviously something should be done there like that. I
I
totally am
agree.
on board with that. But there's other things. I don't know. Like
Are you saying that
I
we shouldn't try and impose any sort of code of ethics until we find a serious breach in ethics?
uh I mean they have kind of a code, I guess, and they report some of this stuff, and I'll have to do some more research into whether or not he really did make those mistakes or not, because he seems like a pretty honest guy, and everybody, even the people on the other side of the aisle are talking about how much integrity he has, but I think this is probably just getting blown out of proportion. So I don't see the need for it. And you're going to have to do better than, like there was a sale of $130,000 property. And so we need a code of ethics for these guys. Like they probably already have one. I guess I could be convinced it depending on what it was, but I just don't. I feel like there's so much more that needs to be done in government, and this is not the place that we need to be looking, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Um, I do agree with you in the sense that a lot of this is being blown out of proportion because for a couple reasons. Harlan Crow gave quite a large amount in gifts to Clarence Thomas and his wife. Most of those gifts by the existing code of ethics do not need to be reported. So nothing was really done there. There are some that maybe are debatable whether they should or shouldn't. But what's also important here is that of all the cases that have been before the Supreme Court while Clarence Thomas was on the court, there was only one that had any sort of impact on Harlan Crow's business. And it was only in some sort of ancillary, secondary impact. It had to do with real estate, and Harlan Crow does some real estate work. So it wasn't even like it was Harlan Crow's business that was before the Supreme Court. And so I think this is an important conversation to have, but I don't think there's fire where there's smoke in this particular situation. I think it's an important conversation to have because at some point in the future, we could have a much less ethical justice on the Supreme Court. And I don't want to wait until we have that unethical justice to start imposing some sort of ethical code. I think a good example of that is that there was a lot of gentlemen's agreements, if you will, between presidential candidates. And then Trump comes along and he doesn't follow any of those gentlemen's agreements, like releasing your taxes and some of the other behaviors that was typically done. And people said, "Oh, wait a second, this is always done." And he says, "Well, there's no law. I don't have to do that sort of thing." And so I think that we need to make sure that there's rules in place before we need the rules. No?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe. I think your kind of default is, well, it's like, well, why don't we just put some rules in place? Like, okay, well,
Well, I
what are
mean,
the
we are
rules?
seeing potential for rules being broken here. There was nothing that was really egregious. There could have been political influence or influence on Clarence Thomas. We're not seeing it, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen with someone less, let's say less moral, if that makes you, if because you like the guy, less moral than Clarence Thomas could have been influenced by someone like a Harlan Crow. But you're not worried about that, it seems.
Not that worried about it, really. No, I think, and I think whenever they put these things in place, usually it ends up, causing more harm than good. It's almost as if we say, well, let's just do something. You got to do something. And I think there's so many examples in government where they do something and it turns out to be worse. Yeah, I could give some examples, but we don't want to litigate, nuclear power or the
Right.
TSA or,
But of course,
well, I want to
all
do
we're
something
talking
like, just
about.
be careful. Like, aren't you worried that there's going to be some bombs on planes? Like, let's get the TSA and spend billions of dollars every year and waste a whole bunch of time. And, like, okay, I just think they always mess it up. I don't think it's like, well, why don't we just put something in place in the off chance that someday we have a Supreme Court that goes all the way through the process, working their way up through the judicial system, and then getting fooling the president and his all of his people, and then getting still approved by the Republicans and the Democrats both. Like, I don't know, maybe that's where we should be worried about it. But I feel like there's so many other places. Like, we're not very good at that type of regulation. These are pretty good people, and there's so many other places that we're just ignoring. I mean, isn't it so obvious that just the no trade rule in the Senate? If you do that, how about I'll make you a deal. Get that through for me, and I'll talk about this judicial ethics thing.
I'll make some calls.
Okay.
All right, so we just have just a moment left, and maybe a minute left. I do want to talk for a second about how the media has been reporting this, because if you've been listening to the media at all, it does sound like, breaking news, horrible corruption happening in the Supreme Court. Look at all these things that Clarence Thomas has not been doing, and when you go and break it all down, actually there wasn't a whole lot. Some of the things were sort of unclear as to whether he should have been reporting it, and there were no obvious laws that were being broken. There were some perhaps some ethical listings in some financial disclosures that didn't happen, but it wasn't this big bombshell report of illegal behavior.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we kind of alluded to it in the conversation. A, they're blowing it out of proportion, and B, it's so lazy. It's like they just copy the news story from different news. I don't know who came up with it first, but then they just kind of copy each other, and
Yeah.
and it just kind of becomes this, well, it's well reported, it's well documented, and they're just kind of, it becomes this game of telephone where, except it gets just worse and worse as they talk about it. You know what I mean? It
Yeah,
gets slightly changed, but worse and worse.
it's well reported because they're all copying the same documents, and you have basically 20 people all saying the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And that
But
was really frustrating about it. And another reason why I was not that interested in, like, even when they come up with, like, in the off chance that one day there's going to be some ethical violations, then we can impeach them. Like, there's already mechanisms in place. It's not like if they really do something wrong, we can impeach them.
and I mean, it is a good point that the impeachment is something that we have available for getting rid of Supreme Court justices. Of course, it wouldn't happen with our present Congress, right? Because of the balance, the power balance. But it
Well,
is
it,
there.
it would it would happen if it was Democratic justice that did something wrong, because the Republicans, oh, I guess because you have to get both parties or something.
Right.
Yeah, like it's
Yeah.
whichever. Yeah, 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 probably wouldn't ever happen. But maybe if they did something bad enough, they could be a bipartisan getting rid of somebody. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe. Well,
Unlikely.
it would have happened with Nixon, but we got to call it. We got to call it done there because we got 10 seconds left. So thank you for giving me 40 minutes of your time, Colin, and we'll do this again soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.